Alright, so this is a Kzj90 and Kzj95 buyer's guide.
I personally prefer the Kzj90.
You're not going to get hung up on the middle on trails. They look better, in my opinion. I think they're kind of cool. But it's kind of up to you if you need the extra space. So there's definitely more space. 95, I should say. The Kzj90 is a 4-seater. Technically a 5-seater. The back seat is pretty roomy, and there's a little bit of cargo space. I say a little bit. There is quite a bit of cargo space back here, but when you compare it to the Kzj95, it's a bit different. The back seats in this truck are huge. They recline. They're very comfortable, and your rear passengers still have cup holders, so that is nice. These seats do fold up against the back seat, and they kind of fold down into the floor a little bit. They are removable, so this is about the space of a small size pickup bed back here once the rear seats are removed. So let's look at the Kzj95's seating and interior space. So this is your back seat, right? So there's slightly less rear passenger room here. There is a ton of cargo space in the back, plus this one has the optional jump seats or the fold down seats in the back. So this one will technically seat 6 or 7. So the reason I say 4 on the other and maybe 5 is the middle seat is kind of small. It's like all things with a middle seat in the rear, it can be kind of small, but you know, technically this will seat 7, technically the other one will seat 5. So as for interior space, the Kzj95 definitely has more space. However, you know, this might be a little much for you, or you don't like the way they look, because people seem to be very on the fence about which one they like the looks of better. There are 2 headlight options. You could option round headlights for a more traditional Land Cruiser look, or you could option the square glass headlights as well. So it seems like most of Kzj90s came with these round headlights. Very classic looking. They're the standard 7-inch, so you can fit most of the Jeep headlights. They are H4, so most of the plug and play kits on eBay and Amazon fit just fine. These are also H4. You can convert the square headlight models to the round headlights, and vice versa. They are interchangeable. You just have to get a bracket, a bezel, and the glass headlight. So a lot of people do that. Every now and then they pop up on eBay. People seem to love to do that swap. Some of the trim levels on the Kzj90s and 95s came with roof rails. Some of them did not. So there are crossbars that you can purchase that go across. So the crossbars are pretty standard. They're still sold online, and they just connect between the 2 roof rails. So they're the same between the 95 and the 90. Your spare tire hangs on the back. There is no room to hang a spare. Up underneath the back end of the Kzj90 and 95 as the fuel tank is there. They come standard with a 90-liter fuel tank, but there was an optional 150-liter fuel tank for desert crossings and such. 90 liters is quite a bit. These things can hold a ton of fuel, whether they're the gas model or the diesel model. So I should go into that. There were 2 engine options. You could get a gas engine or a diesel engine. I personally prefer the 1KZ TE diesel engine, simply because it came with the scoops that go through the grill, that go into the hood, that come down through this ducting through a top mount intercooler. The difference between this version of the 1KZ and the version that came in the Hilux Surf and some of the other models is this one has a top mount intercooler. That allowed Toyota to turn up the boost a little bit. They make a little bit more power and a little bit more torque than the older models. As far as reliability goes of the 1KZ TE, the biggest thing seems to be keeping the head from cracking at higher miles. To prevent that, you got to make sure your cooling system is maintained. So you want to make sure that whoever owned it before you had nice clean coolant in it. The previous owner of my truck had the Toyota red coolant in it. It seems like everything was maintained at Toyota, so that's definitely a good sign. The radiator intakes seem to crack over time. and cause the truck to overheat. That's with all vehicles in particular. It's just people put a lot of miles on Land Cruisers, so there are some aluminum upgrades out there. Just make sure if you get the automatic truck, you get the automatic radiator, because it does have an internal transmission cooler inside of it. So all Kzj90s and Kzj95s will have a battery on the driver's side or the right hand side of the truck, and then there will be a space to add a second battery here. It's about $60 worth of wiring to add a second battery to these trucks, and then you just get the bracket that goes across here and anchors here. You do have to get a battery tray to do it or manufacture your own, but you can. It's stupid easy to add a second battery. There are snorkels and other intakes that you can run on these that work right off of the stock airbox. Tons of mods for them. You can turn the boost up quite a bit. A lot of people go up to 16 PSI. They throw an exhaust on it and a front mount intercooler safely. You can run probably up to 10 without any additional mods, simply by throwing a boost controller on it. There is something called a resistor mod as well, where you plug some resistors in to the side of the injection pump, and it kind of tricks it into adding more fuel and more timing. So kind of up to you what you want to do with mods. It just, you know, stay safe with it. So this is the dual battery setup in the Kzj95. Just paralleled across to the other side, positive to positive, ground to the chassis. Sometimes people ground them all the way across with both cables, not really necessary. So I will say, from the factory, there is a factory snorkel that comes off of the airbox. It goes over here and it runs inside the fender to about right here. So if you're going aftermarket snorkel, you probably don't need it unless you're going through water above this line about here. So as far as suspension goes, any suspension components or lift kits from the 3rd Gen 4Runner will fit on these. I would say this, from a suspension standpoint, the first part you always want to change are those lower ball joints right there below that CD axle. So the reason you want to change those is they're known to fail around 100,000 miles. Mine had 145,000 miles on it before I changed those, and I'll be honest, when I pulled them off, they were perfectly fine. But I do think that this was a highway driven vehicle only. I don't think it was off-roaded before. I would caution you on buying aftermarket ball joints from even the parts store instead of going OEM Toyota. So if you read the reviews on a lot of aftermarket ball joints, people have major failures. That is a component on this truck that sees a lot of strain. So I'll be honest, spend the extra little bit of money and get the OEM Toyota ball joint. So for the Prado, it's harder to get parts in the US, you think, but any of the suspension components from the 3rd Gen 4Runner, certain years of the Tacoma will fit this, with the biggest difference being from the frame down on this truck is the rear is disc brakes, and on the other models it's drum brakes. So the brakes you'll still have to get from overseas. I tend to order parts from Australia versus Japan, but only because it seems like they are made for longer distance or rated for higher mileage. So as far as interiors go, the interiors are pretty cool. On the Kzj90 and Kzj95, they have this sweet 90s pattern. There was a hardwood option and leather seat option. I don't see it very often. There's a couple of things that tend to be worn out on these when I see them imported. So the console lid is usually broken. This gentleman has replaced his, and so he's got a nice fresh one. Toyota still makes those. There's an OEM part number for it, so you can replace it. And then the door cards. So at the very bottom of the door card, you can see the fabric coming out over there. Mine was doing that as well. Just like this, and I glued the bottom. So I glued it into place, and you know, it's perfectly fine now. But this seems to be really common. It's a really easy fix though. Sometimes these will be popped out, and that's okay. There's 7 switches that are really easy to change out, and if you need to add more switches, these little coin trays can be removed and replaced. So most of the Kzj90s and Kzj95s that come in will have a Japanese radio. It won't work in the US, so I just put a double din in it with CarPlay, keep it nice and simple. Some of them have a barometer and altimeter. a compass, things like that. This one doesn't work. The one in my truck does work. You can find them online for replacement if you need to replace them. So as far as lifts go, you can lift these pretty high. A lot of people will do a 2 or 3 inch suspension lift and then they'll add a body lift to it. So my personal recommendation, put a 2-inch lift on it from a 4Runner and then put 33s on it. There is some trimming required in this area right here, but it's not too bad to do. You might actually be able to see, I have 31.5 on mine, and I have this aftermarket suspension at stock height, so I rub a little bit right here, which is fine. I'm basically letting the tires wear in here so I know where to trim a little bit. It's not that big of a deal. I've accepted it. The steps that come on these, yes, they affect ground clearance, not so much on the short wheelbase Kzj90s, because you know it's harder to touch the ground with them. But on the longer wheelbase, you'll see a lot of them come in bent in the middle. So one thing to look out for is the doors. Sometimes this bracket goes bad, or this latch goes bad, and you can't just shut the door. See how that's not all the way shut? You really have to slam it to get it shut. Mine doesn't seem to have that problem. A lot of guys will put a spacer in the bottom hinge to bring the bottom out because I guess the hinges sag on them. This one doesn't seem to have that problem, but they'll put a spacer down here. There is a nice door locking feature here so the wind can't kick the door in if you're cooking back here or camping back here or whatever you're doing. So the washer fluid for the rear windows back here, I always thought that was kind of weird. So that looks like that. So some of the Prados that came in, they have this crazy bumper in the front. They're kind of cool. These two are a little different, but there was also a larger brush guard that covered the whole front of the trucks. I think that one's pretty cool personally, but I'm looking for an aftermarket option, probably a weld-together bumper for my truck. So they are the common 6x139 lug pattern, so most Toyota wheels will work. Anything with a 0 to 15 offset in an 8 or 8.5 or 9 width will fill the fender wells on the wide body. There is a non-wide body that doesn't have the fender cladding on it. Personally, I don't like the way it looks, but some people like it. It's more that classic Land Cruiser look. One thing I would encourage you to check is check the frame for rust. So check all up underneath the truck, make sure it hasn't been spray painted over. Make sure it's been taken care of. A lot of these got coated from the factory. There was an optional undercoating to keep them from rusting. Some people did it, some people didn't. So just make sure when you're looking these over, make sure the skid plates aren't too bashed up, and make sure that there's not a bunch of rust being covered by spray paint. So as far as long-term reliability goes, the Kzj90 and 95 with the diesel engine seem to have the most miles on them typically. In Australia, there's a lot of people that have put up to 1 million kilometers on them. This particular one has 220,000 kilometers, somewhere just north of 140,000 miles. So I'm not really worried about long-term reliability as long as you maintain it well. It should be good long-term vehicles for you to own. I've gone from, trying to keep miles off my vehicles to, in particular, my Land Cruiser, wanting to put as many as possible on it as I can. I just like it that way. It's weird. I don't mind jumping in this and going anywhere, whether it's just camping up in the mountains or going to work or the grocery store. These things just seem to take it all, anything you throw at it, and I think that's awesome. So with the 90-liter fuel tanks that these have, you can go a long ways without refueling. Some people option the larger fuel tank on these. Some people still carry fuel jugs, but I'll be honest, like I go half a month without refueling on my truck, and it's kind of crazy. Obviously, if you're a hardcore off-roader, these have IFS in the front. They're not solid axle in the front. They are solid axle in the rear. They're full-time all-wheel drive with a 3-speed transfer case with a standard center lock. All of them will have a center locker, but you have low, neutral, high-low, and high. So it stays in high 4 all the time. As soon as you put it in one of the high-low or low-low, as soon as you do that, it'll lock the center diff. There is some wires you can connect under the dash, and some people will throw a switch over here to engage the center locker in other transfer gear speeds, but that's kind of up to you how far you want to go with it. It is IFS. There was an optional rear diff locker, but don't freak out if you didn't get it, because all of them came with an LSD in the rear. The optional rear diff locker will be right here if you have it. Like I said, it has an LSD in the rear. Some people will throw an E-locker in there. I think some of the Forerunner ones fit. You just got to make sure that the gears match, the gear set matches, or that you find or you put it in the pumpkin. On the VIN plate under the dash, the AO2A on this is the gear set from Toyota, so that's what you figure out what your gear ratios are. A lot of people seem to ask that question. The mirrors on these fold on most trim levels. There's a button next to the steering column. They're electronic folding mirrors. That's kind of a cool touch. We didn't really get that in the US at the time, nor did we get automatic climate control, which these also have right here. So you set the temperature, just keep in mind it's in Celsius. It does have a electric up and down antenna. I leave mine down in particular, but some people want to send it up. So there is a nice little analog clock there too. But that's all I have for a review of these as far as a buyer's guide. That would be my recommendation if you're interested in a Kzj90 or a Kzj95. Definitely explore both. Try and figure out if the 2-door option or the 4-door option is for you. I would say if you're looking for a weekend camping rig, just an all-around good-looking daily driver, the Kzj90 is probably for you. If you're looking for something to take you for weeks out in the bush or on trips, get the 4-door. You're gonna have more space. I'm perfectly happy with the 2-door, but some people really like that Kzj95.
That was way too good.